Jordi Alonso will be presenting All Gorgeous Things on Victorian Reception of Hadrian's Villa in the fourth edition of Nicholas Mitchell's Ruins of Many Lands. Um, Jordi graduated with an AB in English from Kenyon College and was the first Turner Fellow in Poetry at Stony Brook University, where he received his MFA. He has a PhD in Victorian Literature from the University of Missouri. In 2023, he received an MA in Classical Studies from Columbia University. He's been published in Kenyon Review Online, the Banyan Review, Levure Littéraire, and elsewhere. He's the author of Honey Voiced and the Lover's Phrase Book and is currently working on a project involving the Latin poetry of Ubertino Carrara. He teaches at Louisiana State University. Jordi, welcome. We're so happy to have you here.
Thank you so much, Julie, and the rest of SASA. I'm thrilled to be here. I feel like this is a ritual phrase by now, but let me share my screen. Before I start, I wanted to thank the organizers of the conference and this panel. I've had a wonderful time attending today, and I'm sure there'll be talks tomorrow that'll be just as riveting. My talk today is titled All Gorgeous Things, Victorian Reception of Hadrian's Villa in the fourth edition of Nicholas Mitchell's Ruins of Many Lands. Let us enter the ruins, says an anonymous 19th century guidebook, Rome and its neighborhood, visited in 8 days, where, quote, the Emperor Hadrian had surrounded himself with all that imagination could devise and wealth procure in the shape of lavish magnificence and luxury, end quote. This talk seeks to lay out the ways in which Nicholas Mitchell, in his long poem, Ruins of Many Lands, interacted with Hadrian's villa and memorialized his and his readers' imaginary travel to it. It is a short part of a longer project examining how Victorian travelers and writers interacted with material remains of the Roman and Greek pasts. The Emperor Hadrian, and to a lesser extent his residence in Tivoli, which you can see on my screen here, make rather frequent appearances in the poetry of the British Isles in the long 19th century. And it was noticing that was the impetus for this research project. After setting the scene with a few stanzas by Lord Byron from his poem, The Curse of Minerva, I will examine an excerpt of the fourth edition of Nicholas Mitchell's long poem from 1859. So this is the fourth edition. There were a grand total of 8 editions in Mitchell's lifetime, and he kept enlarging them. So I'm focusing just now on the fourth edition. But turning to Lord Byron's Curse of Minerva, we can see that this poem, written on March 17th, 1811 at the Capuchin Monastery in Athens, it was unpublished during his lifetime, this poem. And though it was very much Athenian in flavor, the appearance of Hadrian's name, here Byron calls him Adrian, down here in line 102. The appearance of Hadrian's name, referring to the arch built by the Roman Emperor in Athens, and the anxiety of the poet who is, in this excerpt, being addressed by Athena, set the tone for other poems of the period, which are underpinned by many of the same imperial cares, and that which Maria Luisa Ferrara calls Il culto delle ruine, the cult of the ruins, in her book of the same name. Byron was preoccupied with ruins, as the lines on my screen from The Curse of Minerva show. Before this excerpt, the speaker of the poem eulogizes, quote, the land where Phoebus never frowned before, end quote, and contemplates how certain aspects of the landscape around him are the same as those seen by Theseus and Socrates. Interestingly enough, he mixes a mythological viewer of this landscape, right, with a historical one. Then, taken by the magnitude of this history, the speaker extols the fact that within the confines of Athena's city, quote, the past returned, the present seemed to cease, and glory knew no climb beyond her grief. This is about 30 lines before the exit here. And as he stands alone and friendless, Athena appears and chastises him here in our exit. So she is the she who is speaking. When the speaker of the poem blushes, with his blush of shame that proclaims him a Briton, Athena knows that he is English born and berates him, even though he, that is to say the speaker, had just a few lines previously expressed admiration for the culture of ancient Greece. By equating him with Alaric and Elgin, after reminding him of the, quote, vacant, violated fane, Athena makes it plain that the speaker of the poem, and Byron as the poet by extent, must repent and make amends to Greece personified. Elgin, of course, infamously rather, made off with part of the Parthenon frieze, which remains to this day in the British Museum in London, and has to this day been part of the repatriation efforts that the government of Greece has been trying to get through diplomatic channels. Coleridge's edition of the poems of Byron, this is not the Coleridge the poet, but rather a grandson of the poets. Coleridge's edition of the poems of Byron notes that the words quod non fecerunt Goti, hoc fecerunt Scoti, that is to say, what the Goths have not done, the Scots did, had been, quote, deeply carved on the plaster wall of the chapel of Pandrosos adjoining the Erechtheion. Elgin, to nobody's surprise, is Scottish, and Alaric, of course, was the king of the Goths who led the sack of Rome. By having Athena say these words, Byron, who had ancestral ties to Scotland himself, counts on his readers, similarly educated, to understand the fact that his is a different attitude to classical ruins, especially when they have been further, quote unquote, debased by imperialist Europeans seeking to profit from their associations with the civilizations of Greece and Rome. This now brings us to the main event, as it were, excuse me, the fourth edition of Nicholas Mitchell's Ruins of Many Lands. This poem went through multiple printings and editions since its first publication in 1849. In the fourth edition from 1854, Mitchell observes in a preface that, quote, such a work from its nature must continue necessarily to admit of additions and emendations. He assures his readers that the whole poem has been, quote, thoroughly revised and augmented, because the publishers have thought it expedient to stereotype this edition. The present, he says, is the last time, perhaps, that the author can hope to amplify or correct, and on this account has spared no pains or care in the execution of his task, being anxious to render the work less unworthy than that favor which has been shown it by the general public. Unlike Byron's Curse of Minerva, where ruins are used to clue the readers into the emotional state of the speaker and the general tenor of the poem, Mitchell's epic is designed as a conspectus of, quote, the ruined cities of Central America, the rock temples of India, and the classic antiquities of Greece and Italy. As well as, Mitchell makes sure to tell us, quote, the very interesting Roman remains in the south of France, which are now described, and the ruins on the African coast, and in the Holy Land, and so on and so forth. So this is a conspectus of all the ruins that a Victorian reader might want to visit or at least learn about. Though nowhere does Mitchell state explicitly that this poem is meant to instruct. He is aware of the phenomenon of the grand tour, which I would love to go into, but I'll just have to obliquely refer to it now. The grand tour was a tour in which guidebooks like the one cited to begin this talk endeavored to give the grand tourist, I hope you can hear the capital letters in my voice here, surely male, often wealthy, and perhaps interested beyond the requisite cultural cachet required by a station in the antiquities and history that surround him, a plan to visit these must-see sites. Ruins of Many Lands is subdivided into 3 books. I'll be focusing on the second one here, since it takes Greece and Rome as its purview. And then so book 1 is about Babylon, Nineveh, Petra, Nubia, and Egypt. Book 2 is about Greece and Rome. And then in book 3, we hop across the Atlantic and look at Mayan and Aztec ruins. In book 2, part 3, part of which is on your screen at the moment, I read a Victorian preoccupation with the rhetoric of empire, which comes to a head in the description of Hadrian's summer home in Tivoli, some pages later on. The narrator the narrator casts the death of Rome here as a prerequisite for another transalpine empire to, quote, rise around Albion's cliffs, namely the British Empire under Victoria. By adopting a voice out of time and addressing a reckless man, as well as in points both earlier and later in the book, where, like Byron's narrator, Mitchell's narrator too interacts with the ruins around him, specifically by using deictic phrases like look here or there stands such and such a thing. He implicitly invites the reader, should they find themselves in the same physical place that the narrator is inhabiting, to use this poem as a sort of guidebook and to adopt a laissez-faire attitude towards physically interacting with ruins. Don't try this if you all are ever around there. I don't think people would take kindly on you, sitting at the steps of the Athenian treasury in Delphi or anything along those lines. Mitchell casts his authorial voice as a being out of time, calling to mind a supernatural being like the Sibyl in Aeneid 6. By engaging with a tradition which arose in Romanticism with the publication of the purported poems of the Scottish poet Ossian, an invention of the 18th century poet James Macpherson, where the poet adopts a pre-Christian character's voice in order to make observations about the poet's present and imbue them with the gravitas of prophetic vaticination. Mitchell uses here his speaker to draw attention to the human world and the parallel spiritual and ancient world, which is also found in classical texts. This liminal space is usually accessible only by special demigods and a few chosen humans in Greek and Roman literature. And oftentimes those humans are religiously or artistically attuned ones. Think of, say, Orpheus or the Wates, right? The figure of the poet priest in the Annals of Ennius, where both these poet priests, these Wates, and the fauns, which are just sort of wandering around the countryside, sing using the same meter. Or think of, say, Cicero's De Divinatione, where, quote, the cry of fawns has often been heard before battle, end quote, warning Romans of imminent danger. This preoccupation and intense connection to the past was assuredly in the air during the Victorian period. The sense of being connected to, quote unquote, great men of the past through sharing a common space is a common one in the era. Though George Nugent Banks, then an undergraduate at King's College, Cambridge, wrote in the 1870s, so some years after the fourth edition here of Ruins of Many Lands, a volume of essays about his life as a student. He Banks says, "It is a grand thing to feed where so many great men have fed before," end quote. Likewise, once we just now we'll see the section of Mitchell's poem relating to Tivoli and Hadrian's Villa. We'll notice the abiding principle that I call greatness by extension, that it is a grand thing to walk where Hadrian once did, or as Mitchell puts it, arriving at Tivoli. Reading this excerpt of Book 3 closely, we see an almost panoramic view of the Tiburtine Valley as if in a double exposure, both as it was in the time of Hadrian, quote, in Rome's palmy time, end quote, as a realization of the bucolic Roman trope of the loikos amoinos, the gorgeous things, proud columns, and statues which charmed the eye, we are told, are now, quote, dark, end quote, and overseen by ruin, who frowns where once the graces smiled. Mitchell takes a darker view of the permanence of ruins than does Byron in his description, which I unfortunately had to cut out of the talk, of the neglected temple of Poseidon at Sunion, where Byron laments that these proud pillars claim no passing sigh, end quote. As the excavations of Hadrian's villa had yet to commence in earnest at the time of Mitchell's publication of this fourth edition, we might be inclined to take his descriptions, particularly those in his prose footnotes, as a reliable guide of what the mid-19th century had revealed of Hadrian's villa. Excuse me. Excuse me. Gavin Hamilton, the Scottish neoclassical painter, for example, had already profited from artwork excavated at the villa. And he may be one of the vague group alluded to by Mitchell when he cites in one of the footnotes, quote, some antiquaries who believe the Sibyl's temple, end quote, on the villa's grounds had been dedicated to Vesta. I am no archaeologist, so I'm not super sure whether any of this was accurate. I'm gonna skip a little bit here because I just ramble on about the footnotes. In order to form a more complete picture of the Anglophone 19th century reception in Belles Lettres, to say nothing of the art historical reception of the Villa of Hadrian, we would have, of course, to consider more material. Among which we could count, but not exclusively, excerpts from Robert Bradstreet's The Sabine Farm from 1810, The Widow of Crescentius by Felicia Hemans, 1859, Hadrian's Villa Tivoli by Frederick W. Farrar, 1859, and The Lays and Poems on Italy by Francis Alexander McKee, 1862. Frances Ann Kemble's Hadrian's Villa and Lines on the Arno at Tivoli and The Siren's Cave at Tivoli. Those are two different poems, both from 1866. The anonymous poem Antinous, A Dream of Hadrian's Villa, 1866 as well as a pair of poems, both titled In Hadrian's Villa. So you see how all these poems pretty much have the same titles, and yet all are appearing in this frenzy within 84 years of one another. Um, all of these things, not in an exhaustive list, show a short list of reactions to the villa and to classical antiquity more generally in popular English verse of the late Georgian and Victorian eras, about which no critical work has yet been published. Had I more time and space to explore, in which to explore the reception of the ruins of many lands, I would go in and track reviews of all the editions, establishing a variorum edition of the text so that we could make more insightful comments of just how revised and amended this poem was. Mitchell promises he will do that in the first page of the preface, of course, but I don't think he expected anyone to have read the previous versions of said poem. Once I did that, I could then make more insightful comments of how revised the poem was. And then, since the description of the villa of Hadrian feels generic, I would hope to find any literary or documentary evidence of Mitchell's actually having visited Tivoli. In the prose notes to this edition of the ruins, he does not mention the Hadrian's Villa episode of the whole poem, but he does indicate that, quote, he has not visited every site which he writes of.
I hate
Mitchell's,
to cut you off, Jordi, but we are running out of time. If you
oh,
have
oh,
one or two sentences to
I'm
wrap
sorry.
up, maybe we'll have time for one quick question.
Yes, I'm sorry. I timed myself and then went.
Not a
So
problem.
let me just read my conclusion. It's real quick. This paper is a short trial trench which has yielded surprising and interesting results. Hopefully the larger project will take this and use it as a springboard to look more closely at the different views of different ruins, so not just Hadrian's Villa, as seen in the long 19th century. Thank you so much. I'd be more than happy to take any questions, and I apologize for going a little bit over.
Not a problem. Unfortunately, I do believe we are out of time to make questions happen live, but for those of you in chat and those of you watching, please do go ahead and ask your questions. If you ask them in chat, we can hopefully respond to you today. Or do leave us a comment and maybe we can get Dr. Alonso's questions along the way. Love to hear from you. Jordi, that was a lovely paper. I'm really intrigued by the whole reception of ruins and particularly of newfound ruins in Victorian England and the way that that uh, elevates empire. Um,
Yeah,
Personally, you know,
it's
I have a lot of strong feelings about
so
Sir
do
Arthur
I.
Evans. Let's just say
Um,
that.
oh yeah, no, same. I have so many strong feelings that apparently I timed myself 3 times today, and I was on time. And of course, um, when I show up on stage, that's not the
That
case
is, that's
anymore.
always the way. Thank you so very much. That
Thank
was
you.
really fascinating and I really appreciated it. Um,
Thanks,
and
Julie.
thank you to everyone on this panel. This sort of look at uh, at narratives of past and future has been a really fun topic to explore in so many different ways. And with that, we are going to wrap up session 3 and move on